Mr. President, members of the court, good afternoon. I will focus on why Myanmar's anti-Rohingya hate speech and propaganda and the hateful utterances of the perpetrators of Myanmar's genocidal acts as they were committing them reveal Myanmar's genocidal intent. I will also respond to Myanmar's attempts to dismiss this significant evidence. Myanmar did not have much to say last week about the content of the hate speech, propaganda, and hateful utterances that I outlined in my presentation in the first round. The evidence is essentially unchallenged. Instead, it focused on why, in its view, hate speech and propaganda are not indicators of genocidal intent, and why such content cannot be attributed to the state. Myanmar is wrong. I will address Myanmar's arguments by focusing first on the question of genocidal intent, then on the matter of attribution, and finally on the content of the hate speech, propaganda, and utterances by soldiers as evidence of genocidal intent. Counsel for Myanmar argued that there is no direct inference of genocidal intent from hate speech or propaganda, and that such an inference can only be drawn from a pattern of conduct. The Gambia disagrees. While, of course, hate speech may form part of a pattern of conduct, an issue to which I will return in a moment, it may also support a direct inference of genocidal intent. As Professor Sands explained 2 weeks ago, the court in Bosnia clearly stated and then affirmed in Croatia that the specific intent must be convincingly shown by reference to particular circumstances unless a general plan to that end can be convincingly demonstrated to exist. Evidence of a pattern of conduct is one way to show that a general plan exists, but it is not the only way. The Gambia submits that the evidence of Myanmar's anti-Rohingya hate speech and propaganda, especially that which was expressed by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing directly, and that which was disseminated by the Tatmadaw on Facebook, offers convincing evidence of Myanmar's genocidal intent. It demonstrates the existence of a genocidal plan or policy. Counsel for Myanmar notes that in Croatia, the court did not use speech factors in assessing the existence of a pattern of conduct and the inference to be drawn therefrom. This case, however, is different. First, Croatia was essentially a case about territory. Second, the Gambia is not solely arguing for inference of genocidal intent based on a pattern of conduct, which is how Croatia pled its case. The Gambia is arguing that, in addition to a well-established pattern of conduct as found by the UNFFM, particular circumstances in certain villages convincingly show genocidal intent. Alongside this, the Gambia is arguing that anti-Rohingya hate speech and propaganda and the hateful utterances of Myanmar soldiers provide convincing evidence of a genocidal plan or policy. This is outside the framework of a pattern of conduct analysis. Further, in this case, the anti-Rohingya hate speech and propaganda and the hateful utterances of soldiers are also relevant to drawing an inference from Myanmar's pattern of conduct. In Croatia, the court did not say that speech factors are irrelevant to a pattern of conduct analysis. Rather, it identified the factors that it found to be the most important in that case. In this case, the court should find these indicators to be part of the pattern of conduct and important. As detailed in the IIMM hate speech report, the content that the Tatmadaw disseminated on Facebook was done before, during, and after the clearance operations. The speech was intertwined with the clearance operations taking place on the ground. And some of that content disseminated offers direct evidence on how the clearance operations were conducted and how the military incited genocide. Counsel for Myanmar asserted that the Gambia hadn't even attempted to link hate speech to genocidal intent with reference to particular circumstances. This is wrong. As articulated in our first round, the Gambia is arguing that the particular circumstances of the clearance operations, especially in the main villages, convincingly show Myanmar's genocidal intent. In Maung Nu and Chut Phin, there is evidence of hateful utterances by soldiers, offering proof of the specific targeting of the Rohingya. Witness NJ, for example, testified in her witness statement that such hateful language was used by soldiers during their attack on Chut Phin. This is direct evidence. Finally, Myanmar has not contested the ICTR case law cited by the Gambia on hate speech and anti-group propaganda, nor has it contested the ICTY and ICTR case law on utterances of perpetrators as indicators of genocidal intent. I now address the issue of attribution. First, it is uncontested that the speeches of Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and the content disseminated by the Tatmadaw and Myanmar's ministries and embassies are attributable to Myanmar. Second, regarding the Facebook content disseminated surreptitiously by the Tatmadaw, counsel for Myanmar asserts that the evidence for this is not fully conclusive, citing Myanmar's rejoinder paragraph 1137, the very same paragraph that I displayed for you in my slide number 12 from the first round. With that, Myanmar acknowledged that government employees or members of the Tatmadaw or the police force created fake Facebook accounts, but then suggested without evidence that they acted outside the scope of their employment on their own initiative. There is no evidence for this highly implausible assertion, and what evidence you do have supports the contrary view. Meta, which runs Facebook, investigated and found these accounts were linked to and controlled by the Myanmar military. Nathaniel Gleicher, head of security policy at Meta, testified to this fact in an affidavit. The IIMM investigated and confirmed that accounts taken down by Meta formed an interconnected military network, Myanmar's military network. These findings are corroborated by independent investigative reporting by the New York Times in October 2018. Moreover, Myanmar has tried to reconstitute these networks, and Facebook has taken further accounts and pages down on several occasions to thwart those efforts. The evidence that these accounts were controlled by the Tatmadaw is fully convincing. The content of these accounts, as detailed in the IIMM hate speech report, are directly attributable to Myanmar. Third, the statements of political parties may not be directly attributable to the state, but they clearly show the state's tolerance for genocidal rhetoric. The Rakhine Nationalities Development Party held the majority in the Rakhine State Legislature in 2012 when it called for a genocidal policy. The chair of the Peace and Diversity Party's explicit call for genocidal violence went unpunished. Just a few days ago, in a video posted online with over 500,000 views already, the now former chair of that political party reiterated his call for genocidal violence and said of the Rohingya, quote, "If you don't want to be wiped out, don't come," and quote, "If you come, we will do it," end quote. His party is aligned with the military's Union, Solidarity, and Development Party in the current election. Fourth, counsel for Myanmar says that the views of Buddhist monks are not attributable to the state. He is wrong. They are attributable because the state endorses and disseminates them, which is the case at least for the content from Sitagu Sayadaw and Ashin Wirathu. Sitagu's sermon absolved a ruler for mass genocidal murder because the 500,000 people killed were deemed to be like animals. That sermon was given to troops in October 2017 and then disseminated by the Tatmadaw on Facebook. The state's official message of absolution for genocidal acts could not be more clear. Myanmar does not deny that the military facilitated Wirathu's travel throughout northern Rakhine State after the 2016 clearance operations and before the 2017 operations. That is an overt act of endorsement. Fifth, Myanmar argues that the genocidal intent of individuals like soldiers cannot be attributable to the state. But the state's failure to prevent their genocidal acts is a direct violation of its obligations under Article 1 of the Convention. The genocidal intent of soldiers is also evidence of a state's genocidal plan or policy. Finally, Myanmar argues that the Gambia has not shown that hate speech and propaganda reflect a genocidal intent. The Gambia disagrees. I have already provided historical context from other genocides to show how hate speech and propaganda indicates genocidal intent and led to actual genocide. I focused on messages of dehumanization, accusations in a mirror, and threats to group purity. Those themes are present in Myanmar's anti-Rohingya hate speech and propaganda, as confirmed by the IIMM's hate speech report. Counsel for Myanmar argues that Senior General Min Aung Hlaing's unfinished job speech was taken out of context. The Gambia disagrees. The paragraph about, quote, cooperative efforts and, quote, local people returning home does not refer to the Rohingya. If Myanmar wanted them to return, they could have repatriated them quickly, as they did with witness M1 and other members of her Hindu community. The Rohingya still languish in refugee camps over 8 years later. And we know, through the IIMM's report on this issue, that Myanmar was actually engaged in a demographic replacement effort to bring more Buddhists into northern Rakhine State. Other content in that speech confirms that the Gambia's interpretation of it, which is consistent with the UN FFM's interpretation, is correct. In that very same speech, General Hlaing said of the Rohingya, quote, we openly declare that absolutely our country has no Rohingya race. Furthermore, in that speech, the so-called 1942 Alithankya crisis was mentioned 3 times. I will show you 2 of them. Quote, Rakhine ethnics lost their land in the Alithankya crisis that broke out in Rakhine State in 1942, in which Bengalis attacked, murdered, and coerced them into leaving their homes. We will never let such a terrible occurrence happen again. Quote, during the Alithankya crisis in 1942, over 20,000 ethnic Rakhine people were slaughtered. Bengalis, after murdering ethnic Rakhine people, seized their land and villages and lived there. End quote. The message is clear. The Rohingya pose a genocidal threat and must be dealt with. That is the unfinished job he was referring to, one that has lingered since 1942. As I mentioned in the first round, other Tatmadaw messaging on Facebook repeated their incendiary references to 1942. Myanmar argues that General Hlaing's speech of 20 September 2017 is also taken out of context, and that General Hlaing was talking about immigration matters. In that same speech, he said, quote, this area was a British colony over 100 years ago. We are facing the consequences of their reckless acts till now. At that time, Bengalis from Bengal region were conveyed into the country without any restrictions. Later, the Bengali population exploded and the aliens tried to seize the land of local ethnics. The 1942 Alethangya crisis is the worst in history." End quote. When General Lang later in his speech states that, quote, "race cannot be swallowed by the ground but only by another race," he is clearly referring to the Rohingya. There is a sentence right before the passage that Professor Talman showed in his speech, wherein General Lang said, quote, "collective efforts must be made to protect the minorities of Buthadong/Mongtal region, such as Mro, Kami, Tet, and Dainet." By excluding the Rohingya from those who need protection, it is obvious that he is inciting those other groups against the Rohingya, who otherwise would swallow them up. Myanmar passes without comment on the other speech of General Lang from December 2017. He said that the, quote, "Tatmadaw must fully protect the ethnic minorities in Rakhine region not to have the genocide," end quote. Yet another example of accusations in a mirror. Myanmar further states that there is a difference between hate speech and incitement. We agree. Ms. Jones covered that matter in the first round when addressing other breaches of the convention. I do not need to repeat the distinction that she drew. Regarding the post disseminated by the Tatmadaw in July and again in December 2017 entitled, "Why Did Hitler Kill the Jews?" Professor Talman says that the Rohingya and Muslims are not mentioned in this post. But he does not explain why it was posted or challenge my explanation that the message implicitly draws a parallel between the false Nazi propaganda of the 1939 Danzig massacres and the 1942 Alethangya crisis that General Lang consistently refers to. Finally, regarding the utterances of soldiers, Myanmar points out that the Reuters hate book article does not indicate that those messages are from soldiers. I take the point. But Myanmar has not addressed the other evidence of hateful utterances by soldiers, including those listed in slide 27 of my first round presentation on this topic. The UN FFM has reported on such utterances in many contexts, including during perpetration of sexual violence. Myanmar also passes in silence on the testimony of witness P5513, who indicated that the Tatmadaw soldiers' views of the Rohingya were shaped by the military's propaganda. So too does it pass in silence on the many fabrications and other forms of anti-Rohingya propaganda disseminated by the Tatmadaw and taught to its soldiers, who ended up committing the genocidal acts. Those were cited in footnote at pages 50 to 51 of the transcript for the afternoon session of 12 January. In conclusion, the Gambia submits that Myanmar's anti-Rohingya hate speech and propaganda and the hateful utterances of Myanmar soldiers during the clearance operations are powerful indicators of genocidal intent, both of Myanmar's leadership and of its soldiers committing the acts of genocide. Thank you, Mr.